back on the Zero Hour. I'm your host, Richard RJ Eskow. Thanks to the work of some really dedicated folks out there, the topic of student debt cancellation has gone from a fringe idea 5, 6, 7 years ago to a very important topic of serious political debate. That debate continues, or there continue to be people who challenge the idea, but vastly growing number of people support it, either in part or in full. And here to talk about it with me now is economist Marshall Steinbaum. Marshall is a senior fellow in higher education finance at the Jain, that's Jain, Family Institute. He is a professor at the University of Utah, and he's one of the authors of the seminal Levy Institute study on the macroeconomic impact of a student debt cancellation. Sneak preview, it's good. That has influenced and shaped the debate in many ways. So without any further, I haven't talked to him for a while, so I'm happy to catch up with him. Without any further introduction, Marshall Steinbaum, welcome back to the program.
It's great to be here. Thank you for that generous introduction, Richard.
Oh, you bet. I could have said more, but, so Marshall, you've been writing about this topic for a long time. We've had many conversations, including some on the air about it. And you've looked at how broad student debt cancellation, total student debt cancellation would reduce the racial wealth gap, how that original study I referenced talked about how it would create millions of jobs and economic growth and so on. And while, of course, it's now a number of years later, I assume those general beneficial impacts continue to be true in some sense. The quantitative numbers may be a little different, but the idea is the same. Good idea. It's gone from a fringe idea to, as I mentioned in my intro, to one that was a big part of last year's election. Freudian slipping, not George. Joe Biden said that he would cancel $10,000 of student debt. There's a heated debate about whether he can do anything by executive action and so on and so on. There's Chuck Schumer and Elizabeth Warren in the Senate think he can and that he should cancel 50,000. Others are pushing for action in Congress. But recently you had a Twitter thread that I thought made a number of great points I wanted to explore with you. And this was in response to a piece by Matt Iglesias, the economics writer, that frankly, my memory of the Iglesias piece has faded a little bit, but I think he was basically snarking on the idea. I think he was arguing contra all the political and economic evidence that the argument for student debt cancellation was fading rather than growing stronger and gaining more traction. First of all, am I more or less accurately characterizing Iglesias's piece?
Yeah, I think it's worth saying that the jumping off point for his criticism of the idea of canceling student debt was that the macroeconomy, according to him, is operating above full employment, and that gives rise to inflationary dynamics, and therefore the stimulative effects of cancellation that we pointed out in the report you referenced are no longer accurate or no longer active. I think so. You said, the basic idea still holds. I think Iglesias would disagree with that, just to give him the due that I don't know if he deserves, but at least might as well start the debate off from, everyone in the proper position.
Sure. So his position would be that unlike, let's say, 2017, when the paper was being written, that now, and you hear this argument a lot, right, that now the economy is in danger of overheating, so we got to make sure people don't get too much money.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? I take it you do not ascribe to that theory.
No, I mean, I'm not a macroeconomist, so I think I started off the thread that you referenced by saying I don't want to discuss this from the perspective of macroeconomics, right, although I'm happy to do so now. The reason why I don't want to foreground the macroeconomic case is because I don't think that's the politically decisive question. When we consider, first of all, why the policy proposal to cancel student debt went from fringe to kind of at the center of the debate, as you characterized it correctly, I don't think, or at least my assessment is, the macroeconomic component of that faded away to some degree, and what's really going on in the opposition to it and what the people who oppose it are really arguing about is the role of higher education and higher education policy, and in my view, a false assessment of who student debtors are and how they got into the position of having student debt, and specifically having student debt that's not being repaid. So to just briefly touch on the macroeconomics, because I don't want to dismiss it as being irrelevant, even though I don't think it's the decisive question in the politics. We've now had a repayment pause for nearly 2 years. The president just extended it by another couple of months. And my view is that along with other supposedly emergency pandemic income support policies for households, is a good reason why the period of the pandemic has not been significantly worse, economically speaking, for the United States. So a lot of people have suffered a great deal, but on the whole, people's well-being, at least as measured economically, is pretty good, or was, as so long as the child tax credit was in place, so long as the extended and supplemental unemployment insurance was in place, which has now been 6 months or so since that went out, and as long as the student debt repayment pause has been in place. So in that sense, I view the repayment pause as vindicating the predictions in the macroeconomic paper. And I guess if there's any disagreement between me and Iglesias, or between Iglesias and anyone who's making the macroeconomic case for student debt cancellation, it would be, is there still kind of room between potential GDP and actual GDP, to use the macroeconomic jargon? If we canceled student debt or prolonged the pause, is that going to just cause inflation versus create jobs, as you characterized it? So that's kind of where we are.
Okay,
on
good.
On the macroeconomic side, but we don't have to
right, and we can also put a pin in, since we are talking a lot about the economics here, in the moral argument too, which exists entirely independently of the economics, macro or micro, right? If in fact it was socially unjust to impose this debt on people in order to obtain what we might argue is a public good, then the macroeconomic impact of it, even if there is one, even if Iglesias is right, should arguably be addressed in some other way as we correct the injustice, perhaps by going to people with more disposable income than student debt holders. Yeah. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, so I definitely agree with that. I would add one further point to it, which is that it's not, so there's definitely a moral case for student debt cancellation, and an immoral case that student debt is an unjust way to finance a higher education system. The economic case doesn't just hinge on the macroeconomics. So we could have this debate about where the macroeconomy is versus potential GDP, whether potential GDP is even a sensible concept when it comes to macroeconomic policymaking. I think there's lots of economic cases that operate outside the realm of macroeconomics, like the distributional implications that have been the subject of probably most of the heated debate that's happened about student debt cancellation. So would this make, I don't think there's any doubt about this, canceling student debt would make both the income and wealth distributions more egalitarian. That is to say, it is a progressive policy, would make rich people or make poor people more rich than it would make rich people more rich. I don't know. That's a tortured way of phrasing it, but that's an economic case that is, at least in principle, not moral and is also not macroeconomic. The other piece of this, I think, that Iglesias didn't touch on at all, that should be foregrounded, especially when it comes to the repayment pause and whether that should be extended or that should just be canceled outright, is that people aren't paying back their debt anyway, and that is definitely an economic fact. My view is that people have had to take on more student debt in order to get basically the same job that they would have previously been able to get with a smaller amount of student debt had they been born in a previous cohort, either because college was cheaper or because jobs just didn't require higher education at all. So that fact means that people with a given amount of income are sitting with a higher debt burden now than they would have been in the past. And that's why, in my view, we see non-repayment even absent the repayment pause. Like before the repayment pause began, balances on a lot of people's student loans were getting higher over time, not lower, because of income-driven repayment and all of these other, or all the programs that make it so that even if you can't pay, you can get your payments lowered and not go into default in the moment, but your balance just mounts up and up and up over time.
So as since maybe the key point you just made, which I just want to put some bold type headline on or section head on, is you're talking about kind of a credential inflation, aren't you? I mean, in the sense that we don't talk about that much in terms of the justice of the student debt question. That whereas somebody 40 years earlier might have gotten, I don't know, a middle manager job, a job as a professional or whatever, perhaps with just a bachelor's degree or no college degree completion at all. That nowadays that might require a master's or more, and that not only are they paying more per unit of education, but they're actually having to obtain more to do the same job that their predecessors have done. Is that right?
Exactly.
Is that a
Yes.
fair way to put it?
Yeah, exactly.
So that's point number one. And as I go through, my notes from your tweet thread, your Twitter thread, one of the ones that struck me was you wrote as follows: nearly all negative net worth households are in negative territory thanks to student debt, and that category is growing rapidly. Could you say something about that?
Sure. So if I'm basing that specific statement on net worth and the wealth distribution on the Survey of Consumer Finances, which is a survey that's representative of households in the U.S. that comes out every 3 years and has been used for student debt work because it asks people about student debt as a component of assessing their household net worth. And there aren't many, if any, other data sources that cover student debt in a nationally representative way. And what I'm saying there is from my work both on the 2016 and eventually the 2019 SEF, so the 2019 one is the most recent one to be published, that the wealth distribution overall includes more people in negative territory, that is to say with a negative household net worth, more debt than assets. And student debt is by far and away the greatest reason why a household would ever be in negative territory, because for most other forms of household debt, they're secured. And so basically when you take on debt to buy the asset, your net worth goes up by the value of the asset and goes down by the value of the debt. So it's a wash if you finance the asset exclusively through debt. And then, for a house, for example, if you have a down payment, then your debt doesn't go up by as much as the cost of the house. But
right.
So student debt is not secured. So you take on student loans and your household wealth just goes down. There's no offsetting asset. There's very few other forms of debt that are as widespread as student debt that have that quality. Credit card debt is also not secured in general, but fewer households carry credit card debt, and they do so for a lower period of time. So if you look at, basically the student debt crisis, as we call it, which is just to say the mounting balances of student loans in the population, that really started skyrocketing upwards in the 2000s after the 2001 recession. That is the period in which negative household net worth has become a growing aspect of the U.S. household wealth distribution. Prior to that, there were very few households that would be in negative territory.
So if you believe Marshall Steinbaum that as a social condition, households with negative net worth are a problem, then, among other things, canceling student debt would help address that problem very significantly, substantially, right?
Yeah, and I mean some scholars at the Brookings Institute, Andre Perry and Carl Romer, wrote a piece about how we should focus on wealth, not income, when it comes to student debt, and I completely concur with them. So the claim usually is student debt cancellation is regressive because student debtors are wealthier because there are people who go to college, and people who go to college are wealthier than people who don't, and like every single step in the logical chain I just laid out is false. And the way you can tell it is by looking at the wealth distribution. That is to say, the people who have student debt are at the lowest part of the wealth distribution, namely in negative territory.
Yeah, and so a series of false assumptions are built up one upon another, and they're not just sequential. They each depends on the prior, right? Yeah, and you went on to say the usual response to this is, but they're human capital. And you describe that meaning, the value of their education. You refer to a logical inconsistency. Adding human capital to household net worth has to be done for everyone else, number one. And number two, the usual basic social science error of confusing correlation with causation. People with more higher ed credentials have higher income. So do people with more luxury cars. That doesn't mean the very expensive asset causes the higher income. That goes back to our credential inflation business, among other things, doesn't it?
Yes, yes. I mean, I think so. Credentialization, as you characterized it, is like a fact that is a pattern in the labor market increasingly over time. Like that's an entirely empirical thing. This idea of negative household net worth doesn't matter because you should count human capital. That's more of a theoretical argument, and frankly, in my view, a moral argument. Although the people making it don't usually like to see it that way. But basically, they're saying it's not really true. You know, the same way that if you buy a house or a car, your household wealth changes by the net value of the asset net of the debt that you took to take that you took on to buy it. So if you buy a house and put 10% down and take out a 90% mortgage, your household wealth, I mean, I guess if you already had the money, it didn't change at all. But the point is that asset by itself is worth, 10% of the value of the house is part of your household net worth. The
Right.
equivalent statement when it comes to student debt is the college education that you're carrying around, which we assume you have, regardless of whether you actually do, because a lot of student debtors don't have a college
Right.
degree or even any college experience at all, since people take student debt out on behalf of other people. Um, that we have to like equivalently measure the wealth that it purchased for them, and that is the present discounted value of the college earnings premium, which is, if you go to college, then you earn more money than you otherwise would have earned, and that should be capitalized in your household net worth. And that, I think, is like total economist brain. And what I was saying in that thread was, even if you believe that, that your future earnings are somehow capitalized into your present net worth, it's not only student debtors who are in that position, it's everybody who benefits from the college earnings premium. And the fact is that people who don't have student debt have a much larger college earnings premium because they're more likely to come from well-off families. And it's been shown that I don't even really think the college earnings premium is like a meaningful concept, but for the people who do believe that, they have documented that it's higher for people who start off more in a more socioeconomically privileged position, because they tend to go to the schools, the colleges where everyone earns a lot because their daddy went to those schools or
Right.
whatever. When you look at the return to individual colleges or the return to college for individuals, you're getting larger numbers for the people who start off in the better position, which means that so the overall point of that tweet is to say, if you do what the people who kind of subscribe to this philosophy want you to do, what you will recover is an even more unequal wealth distribution than the one that you will see in SCF, in the Survey of Consumer Finances. And that even more unequal wealth distribution will be more unfavorable to student debtors. That is to say, you're looking at student debtors at the bottom of the wealth distribution, and I say that therefore student debt cancellation is not regressive. They're saying, oh, but that's the wrong wealth distribution. You should use the wealth distribution that includes the present discounted value of your future earnings as part of your wealth. Again, that is pure economist brain, but taking that as given, that only makes the wealth distribution even more skewed and makes student debtors even poorer in that modified wealth distribution, and therefore makes it even more the case that canceling student debt is progressive, as I have long contended is true.
And the entire argument is, among other things, so unwieldy. If someone has, pick a number, $25,000 in student debt because they got a four-year degree at a state university, would the value of that be in earnings compared to $100,000 in debt for going to a small private college, Hamilton College in Pennsylvania or wherever? Can you really quantify that the one is 4 times more valuable than the other? Or what if they both went to Hamilton College, but one got a degree in electrical engineering and another got a degree in philosophy? It seems to me any attempt to prove a correlation is going to come to failure, whereas your work and others have shown that canceling student debt has predictable, verifiable effects on reducing inequality, racial wealth gap, and other forces too. Am I overreaching in that description there?
No, I think that's accurate. I mean, the stylized example that you gave, where somebody got, or two different people got different levels of education and therefore different amounts of student debt from the same institution, that's not terribly factual, like as a stylized fact. Um, a better way of phrasing that would be, first, okay, so let's say you have one institution and you have one debtor that has $25,000 of debt coming out of that institution in the same degree, and another debtor has $100,000 of debt coming out of the same institution in the same degree. That's going to be because the one with the lower debt had their parents pay for their degree. That's it.
Right.
So that shows that the student debtors are the relatively worse off people. Then much more complicated is the fact that not everyone goes to the same institution. Among economists, and especially unfortunately among higher education economists, at least until recently, the general trend is towards sort of treating college as homogeneous, or treating any level of educational attainment as homogeneous. And the reality is extreme segregation by institution within the U.S. higher education sector. I mean, this is, as with any kind of very expensive, old, and status conscious institutional landscape, there's huge differences between who goes to which school. And the schools that are most affordable, because they have huge endowments, and also have their graduates earn the most, are the schools that the most privileged people go to. So that's why I say this idea that like both of those notional debtors went to one college, Hamilton College, is not terribly accurate, because you'll see very different student debt amounts depending on which institution people go to, and which institution people go to is very, very predicated on kind of where they started out and what their demographic and economic background is.
And Marshall Steinbaum, I've been thinking about this issue of non-repayment too. You tweeted, for example, Iglesias says nothing about the current reality of non-repayment, so he must think that even if the feds won't collect, borrowers should still suffer. And this, I assume, among other things, includes the fact that if borrowers can't pay back, then the only impact that not canceling their debt has is to harm them in terms of any variety of bad credit and garnishment and all sorts of terrible consequences going forward. So it's kind of it's almost a kind of Calvinistic, well, you took on this debt, you should have known better, and even though there's no benefit to be gained from continuing to hold this debt over you, we want to make sure you experience extreme and prolonged pain because you dared to do it. Is this unfair on my part to put it that way?
No, I think it's absolutely accurate to reinterpret what are supposedly economic arguments in light of what's actually going on, which is very much a moralistic judgment, as you alluded to. I mean, I don't think Iglesias knows, frankly, that there's people aren't repaying student loans regardless of whether the repayment pause is in effect or not. That fact has just not been assimilated by the sort of broader commentariat that opposes student debt cancellation or the continuation of the repayment pause. Their usual moralizing criticism of the idea is essentially a judgment about who they believe student debtors are. That, if we, like, absent cancellation or absent the repayment pause, those people are going to be paying back their debt. And the question is whether that is a just or unjust disposition of facts. And these people view it as it's just for these people to repay their debt, because for any number of reasons, one, that they're privileged already or something like that. So, why should other people who didn't go to college bail out the people who did and took on debt and now can't pay it back? That's sort of like very Tea Party-ish type criticism of student debtors is definitely going on. The way you put it, or I should say the way I put it, and I think your characterization of my tweet was basically accurate. Given that the actual reality, which is people aren't paying back these loans, so the real debate, what's really at stake in the policy is, are we going to have these loans hang over people and have the balance go up and have all the ill consequences that you mentioned? Or are we going to be humane to individuals, where there's no difference by and large in terms of the government's fiscal position, or little difference? much less than these people who oppose student debt cancellation think there would be. So it's basically like the government's not going to be repaid anyway, so we can just put that off to the side. Should people live lives of more misery, or should they live lives of less misery? And basically, for the same reason that the ill-informed commentators like Iglesias think that people should be required to pay back their loans, they think that even in that world, people should live lives of greater misery because they are some socially despised category, whatever is in Iglesias's mind as the identity of student debtors, and especially the identity of student debtors who don't repay their loans. And I think that's morally unjustifiable. Like the government, I mean, can the government afford it? The answer, I think, is overwhelmingly yes. And so, given that the answer is yes, should the government do it or not? Yes, I think there's no real moral question that the government should do things to make people's lives better and not do things to make people's lives worse. And
Right.
I mean, I just have no patience for economic policy, being supposedly animated by real world empirical assessment of what's going on that is in fact motivated by judgment on the part of elites about the population that they really know nothing about.
Well, and of course, a lot of people, Marshall, use the term moral hazard when what they really mean is moral judgment
Yes.
on their part.
Yes. Yes.
You
Yeah.
know, and there's another dimension of student debt that I've been thinking about, which is, and your comments about the current reality of non-repayment relate to that, which is, I've been thinking about this recently, that as far as I know, student debt student loan borrowers pay very high interest rates. In many cases, their payments are used to subsidize other student loans and so on. So, in a sense, student debt borrowers who are not wealthy people by and large. If they were wealthy, they wouldn't need to borrow for their educations in the first place. Are expected to subsidize the student loan program. And that to me seems to be a kind of regressive taxation. That why are we expecting young people, primarily young people who are seeking an education, to subsidize the education system for other lower income young people like themselves? What do you think of that line of reasoning?
I do. Well, here's how I would rephrase it as I see
Okay.
what's going on. Higher education used to be considered a public good, and to that end, it used to be much more publicly funded, especially by states. In the last decades, given the open-endedness of the federal student loan program and the political forces operating in state legislatures, there has been a recognition on the part of fiscal policymakers at the state level that they can get away, in a sense, with cutting funding for higher education institutions in their states because those institutions are not going to die when that happens. What's going to happen instead is that they will charge higher tuition, and the feds will basically write a blank check, at least in terms of originating loans, to enable students to pay that higher tuition. So it's like, if you think of the old time, major U.S. automakers, and I guess all the automakers now, they're more than there used to be that are operating in the U.S. market. They would have financing arms, and the whole point is, somebody walks into a dealership and wants to buy a big, expensive, fancy car. Most people cannot just take cash out of their wallet and plunk it down for that car. So the auto dealers recognize that if they want to boost sales, they need to be able to have financing available. And at some point, they were like, look, the banks are being more tight with their loans than we would want them to be as auto manufacturers. We want people to have, very open credit to buy auto. So we will give them that credit, basically, and we'll become banks ourselves. That is more or less what's going on in higher education, where institutions want students to be able to take out loans in order to pay the higher tuition that they charge. And in that case, the feds have basically taken over responsibility for that, thinking that there's a social good in expanding access to higher education by originating those loans and increasing the limits on the loans they do originate and loosening what amounts to loosening accreditation requirements for schools, so there's more institutions. All of those things were viewed as being pro-social, and it created this, what I would view as an unhealthy dynamic, where institutions are becoming more reliant on student tuition. Of course, they would love to have students that can afford to plunk down the money the way that sellers would want to have customers that can just plunk down the money. But the fact is, the students who are in a position to do that, that is the ones who come from relatively well off backgrounds, like they're already going to college. So if they want to increase their revenue, or at least replace the lost state funding, they're going to need to widen their student population to students who are going to have to take out loans that they're not going to be able to pay down. And the federal government has essentially ensured institutions have the ability to increase that higher tuition, that the market will bear it. At least in the short term, the market will bear higher tuition without causing people not to go to college, because the loans are available to finance it.
And it's interesting to me that the moral arguments are always, whether it's mortgages or underwater mortgages or student loans, the moral arguments always seems to be focused against the borrower and not against the lender, who didn't consider the implications of their broad actions, right?
I think that's a crucial part of the ideology going on here. I think, to get to your point about the regressivity of a privately funded, I guess, and federally backstopped student loan program, it's like the political economy of institutions and of the federal government itself and of outright politicians likes to be able to blame individuals when things go wrong for a policy that they've now repeated many times, which is expand lending to finance the purchase of expensive assets. And then when those expensive assets lose value, blame the individuals who then can't pay off the loans for their poor decisions. Like that's how these things are rigged up. And then when that kind of house of cards comes to grief, it's useful for powerful people to be able to blame the individuals themselves rather than their own policy, which really gave rise to the institutional failure.
That's kind of the ideology du jour. And Marshall, I know we're running out of time, but one last question, which is, I've also been pondering the argument that to the extent that higher education is a public good, and I think it is, but I don't think it's a necessarily an economic public good. I stand John Dewey, right? I mean, I think that education has social and cultural value that maybe can't be put in dollars and cents terms. But in effect, it seems to me sometimes that we're charging students usurious rates to get an education that will benefit everybody at least as much as it benefits them, and probably more. In that sense, we should be the ones owing the debt to them rather than the other way around. But what do you think of that?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely subscribe to the view that higher education, like all education, is a public good, and it's was a mistake from the very beginning to conceive it as something, as an investment in your future earnings. This is the so-called human capital model in economics that is an ideology of privatization of public goods. That's the work that it does. So precisely why it's a public good, I think, is less important, in fact, than, I do subscribe to this sort of Dewey understanding of it as constitutive of a healthy democracy and a democratic society. But just sort of, I view my role in all of this as like yanking this entire debate away from the idea that this is people invest. The purpose of higher education is for people to invest in their future earnings, and that automatically provides a pretext for privatizing the funding model. I think a lot of institutions were kind of eager to take up the idea that, come here and your earnings will go up. It's a useful investment, when that was exactly what state legislatures needed to cut funding and put the bill on the federal government. And that, rising line, that upward sloping line of the total amount of student loans outstanding and the non-repayment of those loans is just the accumulated non-funding of institutions from state legislatures. To bring this back to the regressivity question, because you phrased this tuition funding of higher education as regressive, that's strongly at odds with, I would say, mainstream ideology of higher education, but it is in fact correct, because historically the view was part of the argument in favor of cutting funding from state legislatures was, look, the people who don't go to college are paying taxes in order to fund these universities, which are attended by the children of people who did go to college. And so that's a regressive wealth transfer. The reality is the cuts in funding went towards regressive tax cuts at the state level. And user fees are always a more regressive way of funding anything than broad-based progressive taxation. So, if we're relying only on students to fund higher education institutions through tuition, as you started out by saying, that's putting the burden on the people in society least able to carry it. If we, the purpose of taxes is to share the cost of public goods as widely as possible, and especially among the people who are best able to support that burden, which is rich people. So that's why we need, the funding model for higher education should be progressive taxation, not regressive user fees. So, this whole idea of like, oh, the federal government can't afford to cancel student debt. Well, this is saying, if they cancel student debt, there's some amount of future revenue that would not be collected by the federal government. As I said earlier in this conversation, they're already not collecting a lot of it, but some amount would not be collected. And the question is, can they afford that? My view is sure. And if there was any doubt about them being able to afford it, they can always just raise taxes on rich people where the money actually is, rather than trying to squeeze it out of student debtors that are already not making their payments.
Well, and unfortunately, on that note, we're going to have to leave it there. Speaking of user fees, I'm overdue paying my Easy Pass fine because I forgot to attach it to my windshield. But Marshall Steinbaum, Senior Fellow with the Jane Family Institute and Professor at the University of Utah, thank you for your insights on student debt. As always, great to talk with you. And as always, thanks for coming on the program.
Likewise. It's my pleasure.
And we'll be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.